So in this video, we'll be looking at these concepts of phylogeny and geologic time. I'm basically going to define phylogeny at the beginning and then move into this time of talking about how time has progressed and some of the different events that happened over the course of our Earth's history in order to impact life on Earth. And then we'll be go back more into concepts of phylogeny and see how those things are mixed together. And so phylogeny is a word that just means the evolutionary history of a species. And so here you have our own evolutionary history outlined. On the y-axis, you have the years, and then what the x-axis represents then is change in species. And you can see how, in the upper right then, you would have the most recent thing. In the lower left, you have the least recent thing. And this is one way of showing a phylogeny. We're going to look at some other ways in a little bit. And phylogeny can be on a particular graph like this. You can use any number of traits to decide how things are related. You can use physical traits. You can use molecular traits like molecular phylogeny, where you use DNA and RNA, amino acids, and that sort of thing. And so there's not a lot of limitation here, but you do have to decide on a particular thing, and then everything is based off of that set of parameters. Just a little bit about fossils. We've talked some about this, but I want to talk about how we decide, when you find a fossil, how do you decide how old it is? There's a couple of ways that they're used. One of those ways is called radiometric dating, or absolute radiometric dating. And what this does is this uses the half-life of radioactive elements that accumulate in an organism over time. And so carbon-14 dating is a great example of this. There's a certain amount of carbon-14 in all of us, and as when you die, as you decompose, that carbon-14 is going to slowly turn back into carbon-12. And so this happens at a regular rate. And so then you can then look at the amount of carbon-14 left in an organism and tell then how much or how old that organism is based on that. That's just one example. You can see there on the left, there's some other examples: uranium, potassium, depending on how far back you want to go. And then there's also relative dating. And relative dating is where you look at the fossils that are around the thing that you just found, and that gives you an idea of when this particular fossil would be found. So if you find this thing, whatever that is, around a fossil that you have just dug up, then you know that it fits in this Jurassic period. And so there are fossils known as index fossils that are basically, we know how old these things are. And so we're going to base our findings off of what we know. Makes sense. All right, so how do we divide geologic time? Geologic time is divided into these different words appear that seem large and grandiose, but they're not that hard. Era is the one that is used very commonly. You've heard of these words probably: the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, the Cenozoic era, which is our current era. You don't see eon used nearly as much. And then everything before Paleozoic is usually referred to as Precambrian time, because you have the Cambrian period here, because the period is the next smallest thing, and everything there is Precambrian time. Then there was the Cambrian explosion, which has to do with the explosion of new life, not like an actual explosion that occurred. So then you have these periods, and then after that you have epochs. And so right now we're in the Holocene epoch, and this is considered historical time. For some reason, they drew a dude in jeans sitting down, and that was a good representation of the Holocene epoch. So that's how we divide time. Not important. You will be given this kind of information, so I'm not expecting you to memorize this, but it's just a good base. So now we're going to look at a couple of different concepts that are important and kind of seemingly kind of thrown together, but just so you can have this knowledge as you go into the exam. This concept of plate tectonics, This refers to the continental plates on the Earth moving around. Basically, all the land on top of the Earth is floating around on liquid hot magma. And these floating plates collide with one another. They slide past one another. They slide underneath each other. And these cause things to occur, like if they collide together and neither one budges and they kind of both push up, well, that causes mountains. When they separate, from each other, like you see here in the Atlantic Ocean, this causes, volcanoes and that sort of thing. And when they slip past one another, this can also cause, so that you have this in California. That's where you have these giant fault lines, and so you have earthquakes occurring there. And then you have, right around this ring right here, it's called the Ring of Fire. It's because there's a lot of volcanoes. Well, it would make sense that you would find volcanoes on these tectonic plates. And so that's what you're looking at. And the movement of these plates have caused a lot of problems over the years. And so along with the movement of these plates, these land masses that are on these plates are also going to be moving closer together and further apart. Currently, they're moving further. North America and South America are moving further apart. But at one point, that wasn't the case. Everything was kind of smashed together. But they weren't always smashed together. At some point, they were apart. And so things are just constantly moving. There was a point in time in which everything came together in one big giant mass, which you're familiar with this, of course. That's not it. This is it. It's called Pangea, when everything kind of coalesced into this giant landmass, and this caused a big problem. The formation of Pangea separates the Paleozoic from the Mesozoic era, and those life forms that needed coastline. So you can imagine you're in this weird shaped continent, and then all of a sudden you're living on this coastline down here, and all of a sudden this thing slams into you, and now you're not in a coastline, you're in the middle of this giant continent. And that's not good if you need water. And so a lot of extinction occurred when Pangea formed, and animals that needed water, most of them went extinct, and animals that were able to live apart from the water started to reproduce rapidly and adapt rapidly, and that's where you have reptiles come about. And so that enters into the Mesozoic era, which is largely considered like this era of reptiles and dinosaurs, and that's Pangea, which leads us to the impact theory. Now, impact theory is what separates the Mesozoic from the Cenozoic era, which is the common era. This is the idea that at some point in the Earth's past, there was this giant asteroid, meteor, comet that hit the Earth, and it caused all the T-Rexes to run screaming. I don't know why all the pictures of them are shown this way. It just fascinates me. But yeah, you get the idea. Apparently, there was this giant asteroid thing that hit the Earth, and it caused a dramatic climate shift in the Earth. The Earth was covered in darkness for hundreds of years because of this, and it caused the Earth to cool down and dramatically changed the climate. If reptiles need heat and they need sunlight, and because they're not able to control their own temperature, and so then those animals that are able to do that are going to succeed. The ones that aren't are not going to. And this is where mammals came on the scene, is after this impact theory. And remember, just as a way of thinking about this, when you have this one period of time that is followed by rapid change and then a period of no change at all, that's called punctuated equilibrium. And so typically in these events like impact theory, Pangea, you have these punctuated equilibriums occurring. Now, what about Precambrian time, going backwards here? What caused the Cambrian explosion? Well, the idea that what caused the Cambrian explosion is something called Snowball Earth. This is where the Earth turned into a giant frozen ball for whatever reason. More than likely, glaciers in the north and south creeped over the continents slowly until they met near the equator, and you have very little of the Earth that is not just frozen. And so those places that aren't frozen, you're going to have a concentrated area of life, things that are able to live, adapt. They're going to adapt and evolve rapidly during that time, so that when the Earth thaws out, you have this Cambrian explosion. Most of the life and all of these events are characterized by massive amounts of death. But as we've talked about earlier, death is really what drives evolutionary change, because those things that survive are going to be the well-adapted ones that move into the next time period. Switching gears completely. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things we've mentioned these before. We've mentioned homologous structures, and I want to make sure we get to understand between the difference between homologous structures, and there's some different homologies here we'll talk about. So you have physical homologies, where you have this is the vertebrate form, and you can see all the bones are the same, but the functions of these things are not the same. But you can also have homologies in other places, like embryological homologies, where you have similar structures but not necessarily similar functions. These gills stick around in all of these animals. They just have different functions. For the fish, they breathe. For us, they turn into our inner ear bones, and everything else is somewhere in between. You get the idea. There are even molecular homologies, where you have similarities at the molecular level that don't necessarily translate to the same kind of thing. Every animal has hemoglobin, for instance. Well, that hemoglobin is going to be different depending upon the species, and you can show relationships between those species based on that. This is different than analogous structures. Analogous structure shows similar function. Birds' wings and insects' wings, they do the same thing. We understand wings as the same kind of thing. We understand fins as the same kind of thing. Does a whale fin and a fish fin, are they structured the same? No. So an insect wing and a bird wing is not structured the same either, but they have a similar function. This is different. This is the backwards of a homologous structure. Analogous structures are closely linked together with something called convergent evolution. What is convergent evolution? Again, this is where you have similar kinds of selection pressures. Why are there sugar gliders in Australia and flying squirrels in North America? Because there are similar kinds of selection pressures that would lead to similar kinds of species. They are not necessarily closely related, but they have similar kinds of adaptations for their environments. That's what convergent evolution is. So how can you show these relationships? Well, we showed a phylogenetic tree in the very beginning. And so this is a type of phylogenetic tree called a cladogram. And a cladogram shows very simple relationships. And this table here shows where this person has taken some traits that they would like to compare, and they've got a group of animals here, and they basically are putting ones and zeros. Through their 0, they don't have it, 1 they do, and the one at the very bottom has none of these traits, and at the very top you have all of these traits. And so what is this showing? This is very similar to the one that we saw at the very beginning. This is showing geologic time. And again, as you go up to the upper right, you have the most advanced type of organism, and then the lower left you have the most primitive. And you can do this by using one of these tables to show which traits that they have. And so let me just talk you through this. So at this bottom, you have this little thing called a lancelet. It doesn't have any of the characteristics that we have here on this sheet. These characteristics are often called a derived characteristic. It doesn't have any of them. So it's often times used, or the term used is called an outgroup. Think of it as like the control. It is what everything else is based on. Why would you put a lancelet here with everything else? Well, to use it as a control. It doesn't have anything. Well, the lancelet shares a common ancestor with everything else on here, and it's right here at this point. It's kind of like the branching point of a tree. At some point in this right-hand side branch, the vertebral column developed. Well, then you're going to have everything else. All of these organisms past that point have a vertebral column. Then you have the lamprey. The lamprey doesn't have jaws, right? It does have a vertebral column, just not jaws. And there's the lamprey out there. Here at this point, you have a common ancestor between the lamprey and all other organisms or all other animals. You get the idea. And it keeps going. Hair is going to be the last thing. Nothing else has hair. Only leopards have hair. You get the idea. And there can be crosses. There can be like little branches up here too as well. You're not going to have to construct one of these on the exam more than likely, but you would have to read one of them. And so being able to read one is helpful just to help you answer questions. I mean, you will see one almost guaranteed. Sometimes though, it looks like this, very similar kind of thing. So you have Drosophila, which is a fruit fly, and the fruit fly shares a common ancestor right here with all these other animals, right? And then the lancelet shares a common ancestor with all the other animals as well. And you get the idea. The difference here is the longer the lines are, they show time as well. And so you can see that in order for Drosophila and humans to be related, you have to go way back, whereas you don't have to go nearly as far back to see where humans and rats and mice are related. But fish are related to mice, but you have to go back pretty far. You have to go all the way back here. So you get the idea. This is just, you'll see a problem like this, and then they'll ask you some questions about it. You just need to be able to read.